I'm gonna break into your heart. I've been listening to Iggy Pop's 2016 album, Post-Pop Depression, pretty much in permaloop, while I was thinking about and re-listening to the past 4 Over Heaven videos for the sake of this analysis. And now it's completely stuck in my head. For a long time, I thought the best 2016 album was Black Star. But recently, I've had to doubt myself on that matter. And more, I've come to agree with James Acaster that 2016 was probably the best year ever for music releases.
Yep. But others might disagree that 2016 was the best year. I mean, it's not something one can prove objectively, is it?
If other people own over 500 albums from a different year, I'll listen to them.
But that's a different matter entirely. Let's jump into this analysis video. I don't have much to say because, thankfully, Dio himself seems to have spelled out a lot of the more complex ideas within the text itself. And these past few chapters have been really, really fun to read and interesting to read because you really get an insight into how Dio thinks and more about his personality and his character rather than simply a recapitulation of his past. And I feel like I've been saying this for the past few analysis videos, but more and more, it feels like Dio is finishing his thoughts, you know, so that we don't have to step in and be like, is this what he meant? Is this what he's trying to get at? How does he feel about his mother, etc., etc.? We don't have to play Freud, get Dio to sit down in our couch and look up at the ceiling and close his eyes and whatever. We can just sort of take him at his word. You know, he talks about certain characters like George Joestar. By now, we've talked enough about how he feels about heaven and how he feels about his parents specifically, that when he says that he thinks George Joestar is going to heaven, we have a pretty good grasp of what that means. And we also get a really nice through line on why Dio is so perturbed by the idea that George Joestar would willingly take poison if it was from the hand of his son. Of course, it is a perturbing idea that you know, someone could be so selfless and so loving to someone whom they consider their son, that they would do such a thing. But that, you know, that's the argument that Dio puts forth in the text, and he really spells it out. And so I was pretty happy to see that. It means I don't have to spend a lot of time, you know, talking it out and hashing out the details of why Dio would feel that way. And even the more like philosophical topics, you know, we briefly heard Dio saying, what does it mean to be human? He quotes Pucci from the previous chunk, let's say, saying that to be human is to aim towards heaven. And so even if he has rejected his humanity, even though he has cancelled and quit his mortal life, maybe he can still have some claim to be human because, after all, he is still trying to attain heaven. And, you know, he tries applying this to, of course, the orangutan, who is the user of strength, to Horus the falcon, who is the user of, Pet Shop the falcon, who is the user of Horus, and also to Iggy the dog, who is the user of the fool, because these are animals, obviously. And do animals have even a concept of heaven? If not, then how can it be that they have stands, or I guess they have a soul, that they have some ambition for things to be better, that they can fight to maintain that better, to achieve that vision of what is better, right? And that's sort of what it means to act in the first place. We briefly heard Dio saying that for his mother, all she had to do to achieve heaven was to leave her home. That's how easy it was, but she didn't even do that. And so that's one of the reasons why she is so foolish in Dio's eyes. So that's pretty cool. I was going to go on a little bit of a rant of something I've been thinking about, especially with all the sort of alien stuff that's been happening, the UFO reports and all that, about how consciousness, and especially from a Christian perspective, we talk a lot about the fall of humanity because Adam ate the apple. But I was going to go on this rant about what if Adam isn't a representation of man, but of consciousness itself. You know, it's the male aspect of the consciousness. And when Adam ate the apple, it was actually the fall, not of humanity per se, but of consciousness as such. And so if consciousness emerged, not only for humans, but also for any alien species that might exist, what if, bada bing, bada boom, they are also fallen creatures? Now, from a strictly Christian perspective, there's also a lot of like, you know, like why would Christ specifically come down to Earth as a human if there's all these other fallen species everywhere? Does his sacrifice for humans also extend to all the other species? That seems kind of redundant because the whole point of Christ's sacrifice was that it only needed to be done once. There's a lot of like theological topics that I could dive into, but I won't, mainly because I'm just I've gotten really, really interested in theology, not religion per se, but theology specifically, Christian Catholic theology. I'd love to entertain the topic. The main point that I would have gotten to in the rant was that maybe consciousness isn't a uniquely human thing in the first place. Maybe heaven isn't a uniquely human thing in the first place. But I'm not going to rant about that. I'm just going to go straight into this analysis. First of all, what you'll notice was that there was a greater intermingling or interweaving of the narratives from parts 1 and 3. You know, Dio is more and more at a greater depth, recalling details from the story of part 1. While at the same time, the story of part 3 is getting to sort of the meat and potatoes. Abdul just, scare quotes, died in India, and they've slowly made their progress across to Saudi Arabia. Surprisingly, Dio doesn't actually say that, oh shit, Abdul's still actually alive. That was a mistake. I guess nobody ever was able to report back to Dio that, hey, hang on a minute, they met up with Abdul just as they killed Judgment. So that's actually pretty interesting. You know, when I say that Dio's voice and Dio's character is becoming more and more pronounced, it's little stuff like this. You know, Dio obviously isn't omniscient, so it's nice to see him as more of a character rather than just the evil guy in the shadows that we saw him as in part 3. But more importantly and more thematically, Dio, the interweaving between parts 1 and 3 sort of hinges around this idea that Dio is constantly failing, and Dio places the blame at the feet of external circumstances, which is quite interesting. First of all, this is something unique about JoJo, I think, in that normally the villains win at least a few times, right? Like, there's usually a bit of give and take, but you think about Empire Strikes Back, for example, sort of the classic example. What happens at the climax of that movie? Luke loses his duel against Darth Vader. And of course, Vader has the big reveal to Luke to really get him down in the pits. By the way, you're the son of the most evil person in the galaxy. Mwah. But JoJo, parts 1 and 3 are very similar in that Dio always loses. He never wins. He never gets anything his way, but he still becomes more and more powerful. Really, I think that's a reflection, not of Araki's writing ability, because, like in part 2 especially, we see Joseph losing quite significantly. In part 4, I think part 4 did this best because there's sort of this Pyrrhic victory right in the middle, where Kira obviously has to change his identity because Josuke and his gang figure it out. But it comes at the cost. Well, firstly, Shigechi dies, then that sets off the whole investigation. So that's a pretty big loss. But also, Koichi gets absolutely obliterated, almost dies. He has a hole in the center of his chest where his heart should be. So that's pretty catastrophic defeat. And then Jotaro nearly dies. So, it's a really tense fight that Araki really toes the line with and and that's why that specific fight is one of the best in JoJo. And I can provide more examples in part 5 and part 6 and part 7, part 8 about how sometimes the bad guys win and win by a lot as well. But in parts 1 and 3, Dio always loses. There is never a moment where Dio is like, ha, finally, I managed to win something. I managed to further a significant part of my plan. But nonetheless, Dio, I think it really speaks to Dio's strength of character. This is what I was trying to get at, and not bad writing on Araki's part. That Dio, despite his losses, will always come back even stronger still. This is something that Dio actually says about Jonathan a lot, in that he always comes back with a fiery spirit, and you can't put him down no matter what. But Dio, I think, only is able to recognize that because he himself is very much like that. So that's a really interesting little detail about Dio constantly failing, that he himself is very harsh about. He doesn't let this lie in his own mind. It's always eating at him. And in fact, it's kind of funny that the number of times he's always saying, I should just say the facts of the story. I shouldn't keep elaborating on why I lost and the factors that led to the loss and how I feel about Speedwagon, for instance, who I'm going to get to, and how he contributed to why I turned into a vampire. He's like, okay, ignore all those and just stick to the facts. But he's always constantly returning to I guess that trauma, right? That's such an overused term. I kind of regret using it, but I can't think of a better word. So I guess trauma will do. He's always returning to what is beyond, what underlies the facts of the defeat. Now, I actually think Dio has a lot of bad takes in that he says a couple of interesting things. First of all, he says that a series of coincidences and a series of mistakes lining up so perfectly can't actually be considered a mistake. It has to be considered as something correct. And that's an interesting idea, but it's juxtaposed by Dio's later words where he says Jonathan only won because of bad luck. And hey, if luck is such a significant player, then how far does it go? Maybe luck, above all other things, is the thing that will get me into heaven. And it's not good works. It's not the 14 words, the rhinoceros beetle, the fig tart, those words. What was it, 14 words? I feel like I got that number wrong. Whatever. Dio seems to be playing both sides of the debates at the same time. If it's good for him, then it was fate. There's no such thing as a mistake in that scenario. But if something bad happens to him, then, that has to be bad luck. And in fact, the bad luck is so severe that it might be the only deciding factor. He's very uncertain about this. Part of that, I think, is the fact that he's so wrapped up in the past and unable to escape it. In that sense, it's sort of a tragic scenario. What he's talking about, by the way, is a pretty big existentialist problem, I think, that hopefully all of us have thought at some point in time, because it is something that is worth thinking about seriously. Not to give you guys like death anxiety or anything. I just think that if you want to look at your life through the correct lens, then you have to have at least appreciated this fact that death comes to us all the same. And something that's been really funny over this past couple of years with COVID is people saying things like, if you take the vaccine, or if you do this specific exercise, or if you eat this specific food, then your chance of dying goes down by a significant amount, which is obviously wrong, because your chance of dying is 100%, always. That's just what it is. You will die, guys. That's just the fact of the matter. The question that really comes from that fact is, why should you care about life if death comes to us all the same? I don't really want to get into like philosophical schools of thought and all that, mostly because I don't think it's really interesting to think about things in that way. But I will name drop existentialism, because it is the school of philosophy, let's say, that tries to answer that with the greatest force. And a lot of people fall under this category. You get Holocaust survivors like Viktor Frankl. You get people like Camus, who talked about, in the face of the tragedies of life, what can we do? And he says, all we can do is just continue on as if all of those tragedies are fundamentally good. He calls upon the image of Sisyphus, the myth of Sisyphus, where Sisyphus is condemned by the gods in hell, in Greek hell, to roll a boulder up a hill. And then once he reaches the top, the boulder rolls back down, and he does that again and again and again for eternity. And Camus says, we have to assume that Sisyphus is happy in doing that much. And so we have to do the same with our boulders in life. It rolls down, we just roll it back up again, and we have to be fundamentally happy in that idea. Dio can't seem to think that way. We actually see him bending towards nihilism as he realizes that he doesn't have any idea what heaven actually is. A lot of the things that he's grasping for, what he's writing in this notebook, are pure speculation at best, and just a rambling remembrance of his own failures. It's sort of like a therapy notebook at worst. And he says this, he says, even if this comes to nothing, well, at least I'll have something to laugh at. So that's kind of a sad thing. I was talking previously about how Dio is traumatized by his past and it's completely latched onto him, but he can't find an actual escape from it. And ultimately, one of the answers that he is tempted towards is simply to laugh at his past, not to learn from the past, but to laugh at it. And I think that's the wrong answer for a lot of reasons. Thankfully, I guess, I'm not really sure if we can be thankful that a megalomaniacal vampire decided not to be nihilistic about his way of life. But all the same, thankfully, as far as Dio the character is concerned, he decides to persist with the path to heaven and not be tempted by the call of nihilism, let's say. But instead he bends towards this complete obsession with the fulfillment of his plan. We hear him say, for example, that Dio is no longer Dio. He's talking about himself in the third person. Classic megalomaniacal vampire stuff. He says that he can no longer be himself, Dio is no longer Dio, if the Joestars force any influence on his plans. And this is another aspect of Dio's pride, which is a topic I'll return to later, so keep it in mind. But, Dio is so prideful that he cannot fathom the idea that he could, let's say, reschedule this particular issue of his desire to go to heaven, until more important struggles, like the Joestars, are destroyed for good. And I think labeling this as pride is important because, for those of you who've been watching my channel as this series has come out, you'll know that I've been reading Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life with a little twist, Hail Hydra. And one of the things I talk about there is that, once again, we return to a bit of a Christian perspective, in that the only way you can really manifest yourself, that Dio, for example, can be Dio, or Dargosian can be Dargosian, or any one of you guys can fully become yourselves, is by assenting not to your own plans, not following through on your own plans, but assenting to God's plans. And the people who choose not to follow God's plans, but instead to follow their own path, that's an instance of pride. That's what Satan is about. I think I said this in the previous analysis as well. Honestly, I've said this in so many different videos at this point that I've lost track of when I said it and where. But what did Satan say? He said, non serviam, I will not serve you, God. And specifically in the 12 Rules for Life audiobook, I was speaking about saintliness, which is, of course, the state of being in heaven. And the analysis that I was providing there was that saintliness, true saintliness, can only be achieved if you fully manifest who you are in your entirety and in all of your goodness. But like I said, you kind of stitch the two ideas together. You cannot be truly yourself until you follow God's plans, not your own plans. And so that's a Christian perspective. I do know that Dio said that his mother's perspective, or the heaven that his mother imagined, was not necessarily religious. And that's fair. Christianity doesn't have a monopoly on the idea of heaven. In fact, it's pretty much a human universal. But it's this assertion of Dio saying, Dio is no longer Dio if he cannot even put aside his own interests for the sake of the greater good, of his organization at least. The greater good of killing the Joestars early. It's this pride and this narcissism that ultimately is at odds with true saintliness, or at least one understanding of saintliness. And we see this again when Dio specifically rejects his earthly names, Dio Brando, Dio Joestar. No, he is simply D-I-O, Dio. Just as he previously, a century ago, rejected his humanity, so too now is he rejecting his history. And again, I could talk about how that's maybe another facet of him trying to overcome his trauma. He's been mired in it. He's tried laughing it away. Now he's trying to completely disown it. So we'll see whether he ever actually gets to the true answer, which is to learn from it. That's been much of the interweaving of the parts 1 and 3 narratives, at least from a thematic point of view. Obviously, a lot of the discussion had to do with Dio talking about the stone mask and his original plans to kill George Joestar and then Jonathan Joestar with the mask. I'm not really going to get into that because I think Dio spells it out more than sufficiently. There's one little point that I want to talk about very briefly, and that's the idea of what if Dio had gone through with the quote-unquote murder of Jonathan using the stone mask, and then Jonathan had turned into a vampire. I do know that there actually is a fan comic where someone spelt this story out, made it into something real. And just as for Purple Haze Feedback, I did a little analysis of another fan comic called 5 Meters of Jekyll and Hyde. So too will I be going to this manga at the end of Over Heaven, so keep an eye out for that. We're almost at the end. I want to briefly touch on 2 characters that were made important in these few chapters. First is Enya. She has this amazing plan to go and kill Holly Cujo, but Dio actually chickens out. And I think we see here again another facet of his trauma. This has to do with so-called holy women, and how terrified he is of insulting, demeaning, harming such holy women. And I think the phrase holy women is interesting because, once again, returning to the Christian perspective. And you might be wondering why I'm always turning to the Christian perspective. One of the reasons is because Araki himself is Christian. I think I said this before. It might have been in the 12 Rules for Life reading. But a lot of the ideas sort of baked into JoJo are of a Christian nature. And so it's really easy to just draw the parallels between like Christ and the Joestars, or Satan and Dio, or maybe Satan and Diavolo would be more appropriate, etc., etc. And more importantly here, holy mothers, and of course the Holy Mother, which is Mary. This idea that to harm Mary is even more grievous and even more sinful and will lead to even greater calamity than actually going out there and fighting against the Joestars, or I guess Christ in this metaphor. I think that's a really interesting idea because in many ways, Mary is, this is gonna be heresy. Mary is more important than Christ. There's a few Christians who did not like that. It's okay, there's a dislike button there for a reason. Because without Mary, without the perfection that she is actually immaculate. Without that, Christ could never have been born. And I think there's a very similar idea that is being played around with not with Jonathan really, because we talked about Jonathan's mother in the previous analysis. And Dio hints that Jonathan's mother was possibly just as holy as Dio's mother. But definitely with Irina, and definitely with Holly, we see this imagery being played out that she is actually more important than he. But more interesting is the flip side, which is that Dio, in many ways, is also the Christ figure to the Holy Mother of Dio's mother, who's never given a name. And that's really what the draw of Over Heaven is, especially the early chapters where he's really just hammering on about his mother and how she was foolish to have lived in the way she did. And this doesn't really have to be spelled out, but of course the tragedy is that Dio is very much the fallen, is not really a Satan figure, but more of an anti-Christ figure, in that he very much could have been Christ-like. But was it because he was never given the opportunity? Or was it simply that it was never in his nature to have acted so selflessly as the Joestars do? And Dio, for what it's worth, spells that out very clearly in his discussion about Speedwagon, who is the next character we're going to talk about. But first, I just want to wrap this discussion up about Enya. I don't have much else to say. Her son dies, Jay Guile. She dies. And Dio actually orders her death, which is kind of a little bit twisted, because her relationship with Dio is never really spelled out, but it's often hinted that Dio had no one else to trust. Of course, he meets Pucci, but that's more something that Dio actively pursued rather than something that was implicit in the relationship in the way that it was with Enya. One thing that I will say is that, obviously, in the previous analysis, I noted that I haven't watched Part 3 in a long time. When I get to rewatching Part 3, I'm pretty sure that Enya's relationship with Dio won't have any of these little nuances that I'm trying to poke at here. And I'm pretty sure she will end up being just as shallow as I thought she was before Over Heaven. But I think, this is the value of Over Heaven, that we can get characters like Dio's mother and Enya, who is very much not a holy mother, who's very much not a representation of the Mother Mary. And we can really dig into their lives and extract more about them. Okay, that's enough about Enya. Speedwagon. Speedwagon is kind of the opposite, I think, to Enya, in that he does appear shallow, just like Enya does, but he's really not. Really, I think he plays Dio's foil, another one of Dio's foil. Jonathan also is a foil. But Speedwagon is a lot closer to Dio as a foil, in that they have similar backstories, but they end up in very different places. Kind of more like Rohan and Kira being foils of each other, as I talked about in a previous analysis. Even if Kira's primary rival ends up being Josuke in Part 4. And I think the main reason is that Speedwagon doesn't just pop out of nowhere as a sidekick good guy. The way, I guess Koichi would be a good example. Koichi does have character development. That's not what I'm trying to get at. But Koichi was always a good guy. His development had nothing to do with his goodness. In fact, his goodness was his primary flaw. That's kind of interesting. Speedwagon, on the other hand, directly tried to attack Jonathan in their initial meeting. You might say Okuyasu tried to do something similar, but unlike Okuyasu, Speedwagon was very much just a very minor character. But there's something, I think, magical about that, and something that really distinguishes him from Dio, in that Dio, in a lot of ways, he is very much the main character of part 1, far more than Jonathan is. And the story could easily have been about Dio, as Dio himself says, what if I had put the stone mask on Jonathan? Then I would have had to be the Hamon initiate. But Speedwagon never had that opportunity. You could never say that the story of Phantom Blood is about Speedwagon and his journey, these eccentric people. Part 7 is kind of like that, in the sense that Johnny starts off more as Gyro's sidekick and slowly grows and matures into a fully fledged JoJo, as it were. Man, I keep talking myself off of Speedwagon. Speedwagon started off as a side character and remained a side character for all of it, but he started out morally corrupt, bankrupt, let's say, and he turned to goodness after his meeting with JoJo. And the answer, I think, is pride. And I'm not going to spell this out too much because I think the point is actually very easy, but I am going to quote from John Milton's Paradise Lost. Now, I'm actually going to quote it from 12 Rules for Life because I've started reading the second half of 12 Rules for Life for the rest of the audiobook. And Jordan Peterson actually quotes John Milton there. But I just want to give you this specific quote and then we'll wrap up the discussion on Speedwagon. So give me 2 seconds. Here we are. This is Satan speaking after he, as Lucifer, has been cast out from heaven for rebelling against God. This is what he says. Here we may reign secure, and in my choice to reign is worth ambition though in hell. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. Oh, shivers. So, who is he who reigns in hell? That's Dio, obviously. He literally creates an army of zombies and creates, these abominations of nature. The head of a cat sort of glued onto the body of a falcon, all kinds of weird stuff. Obviously very hellish. Who is he who serves in heaven? Speedwagon, obviously. Speedwagon lived in a hell of sorts, Ogre Street, just as Dio lived in that hellish town of his. But he saw the glimpse of heaven, and he decided to serve it because he knew nothing better. He knew nothing better. What is the thing that separates Dio and his desire to reign in hell versus Speedwagon and his desire to serve in heaven? And of course the answer is the most grievous of the 7 deadly sins, pride. And I just love that quote. It's great. I love it. A lot of these ideas I talk about in greater depth in my 12 Rules for Life audiobook. It's not just me... Let me put that away. It's not just me, reading the entire book. There's also a lot of interjections that I place in talking about ideas like this. Sometimes even talking about Over Heaven specifically, just because I feel the themes overlap so well. But I see here that I've actually talked a lot more than I intended to, as is usual. And unfortunately, I'm a bit hurried. So instead of wrapping this up in a nice bow tie, I will continue this tomorrow. No, I'm kidding. I'm gonna wrap the video up. A lot of you guys commented on how often Dio says that. And I think it's funny, but honestly, when you're writing in a diary, there's no reason for you to not just continue tomorrow. So I think it's really realistic of Dio to just be like, I'm too lazy for this shit. Fuck this. Just throw the notebook away. I'll continue this tomorrow. I think it's very funny, but also, like I said, it gives Dio a little bit more character and a little bit more personality, that he isn't always so keen on doing this thing. He just has to because he believes this is the path to heaven. That being said, yes, I actually am done. And I won't continue this tomorrow because I have nothing else to say. But the next analysis, I think, will come quite a bit later. And we will have covered a vast majority of the book by the time you hear from me again. We are halfway through the entries, but like I said in the previous analysis, I am kind of trying to sprint through the finish line. I only just heard that, or I only just saw the release trailer, which came out like 2 or 3 months ago, for part 6. And I didn't even know that was happening. So I'm actually pretty glad that I've finally gotten around to finishing this audiobook once and for all, just in time for part 6 to come out, I guess. I don't know if they've got a release date for that, but yeah, I'm excited for the book to finish. And over the next few days, over the rest of the month, you should be seeing a significant amount of the book will be completed. And then we can analyze it, and yeah, we'll continue from there. So until then, I'll be listening to Iggy Pop, of course. I'm gonna break into your heart. I'm gonna break into your heart.